Power is slowly returning to Cuba after yet another nationwide grid collapse. But as of Tuesday, only about 2/3 of the nation is actually still without electricity. Officials are investigating what caused the latest blackout. Cuba's ongoing energy crisis worsened dramatically in January, and this after U.S. sanctions cut the island off from its top oil suppliers. The U.S. says that the pressure is intended to force Cuba's government to allow more foreign investments into its political system. Speaking at the United Nations on Tuesday, Cuba's foreign minister accused the United States government of violating human rights.
The blockade asphyxiates and kills silently. Paying attention to this ruthless crime is also a responsibility of the United Nations. The US government, and in particular its State Department, is spreading the lie that the blockade is not aimed against the Cuban people, but only against the government. Well, ask the people of Cuba whether or not they are suffering because of the blockade. You may even want to ask diplomats, correspondents, and other foreign citizens living in Cuba.
All right, let's bring in Brett Bruen. He's the president of the Global Situation Room and also a former State Department official. Brett, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Paul.
So tell us about the significance of this Cuba debate that happened on Tuesday at the UN General Assembly, but perhaps most importantly, what this means going forward with this effective U.S. blockade of Cuba's fuel shipments.
Well, let's start with the fact that it shows increasing U.S. isolation on the most important world stage. We really do find ourselves estranged from traditional allies, even those that have been willing to abstain in some of these kind of votes. And it just piles on pressure, not so much on Havana, but here in Washington, as Trump is trying to ratchet up both economic, but also conceivably political pressure.
There were also some heated moments, though, during that debate, according to the UN. Cuba's foreign minister repeatedly pounding his desk, objecting to what he was hearing from the U.S. In fact, I want to read for our viewers some of the U.S. ambassador to the UN's remarks. Mike Waltz, referring to that latest blackout we saw this week on the island, saying, "This is sadly nothing new. Families once again wondering whether their food will spoil, whether hospitals will have power." And then he goes on to write, somehow, conveniently, there always seems to be enough power for the regime. In your view, Brett, is much of the suffering on the island, does it fall on the Cuban government, or is it shared with the U.S. government?
Well, it's an interesting tactic that Ambassador Waltz is trying to use. He's essentially flipping the script and saying it's not so much our embargo on the island as it is the embargo of the regime in Havana. I don't think you're necessarily going to win that, especially with skeptical foreign countries. However, it is an attempt to try and highlight some of the inequity in how, whether it's electricity or other benefits, resources are used in Cuba. Ultimately, however, we're dealing with a massive humanitarian situation. It doesn't help that the Trump administration got rid of USAID and a lot of our humanitarian programs, and then putting in place this blockade just exacerbates the situation. I think it is going to increase calls from around the world for the U.S. to seek some resolution to this.
We're on Havana's Malecon seawall, and despite the fact that it's a nice night, there's a beautiful sunset happening behind me, there's a lot of concern right now because Cuba is in a nationwide blackout. It has become a fairly regular occurrence here, but even more so now that the U.S. has essentially stopped all oil shipments into this island, is preventing countries from selling oil to Cuba, giving oil to Cuba, trying to make this island make economic and political concessions that up until now the government here has resisted. So we've been seeing daily blackouts that stretch already for most of the day. In my neighborhood, we had blackouts that were lasting, 20 hours or more in recent days. It's very hard to live under those conditions. It's impossible to live when you have days and days of absolutely no power. So if you see some lights on, it's because there are emergency generators. There are hospitals or hotels that are prioritized here. They get a little bit of power from the government. Some people have generators, but of course they don't have fuel for those generators. Other people increasingly have solar panels and batteries, but those are really things that most Cubans can't hope to afford. It's still very hard to bring those items in. And so the concern is, if this goes on for days like has happened previously, that people's food will begin to spoil. We've already seen some anti-government protests, but they've remained pretty small. People are just exhausted by this ongoing crisis. And so even if the power comes back on, it will likely be a couple hours a day at maximum, because this is an island that is running on fumes. The pressure campaign against Cuba has all but broken this island.
Just talk to us about what happens to Cuba if this continues, just in terms of the impact on the economy, infrastructure, food shortages, potential protests, social unrest. Your take on that?
Zane, I think we're in the end game now. Since the beginning of this year, when the Trump administration announced this blockade on fuel imports into Cuba, the plan was always to get to the Caribbean summer, to these hot months of July and August, when even under good conditions, life in that part of the world can be unbearable, in the hopes, from the Trump administration's perspective, of generating some kind of political change. Here we are, and conditions on the island, according to accounts from your correspondent, from Patrick, and from others, has become exceptionally difficult, not just because of the inconvenience of not having electricity, but the effect that it has on things like surgeries in hospitals and the amount of food that is available for Cubans to eat. The question now is whether that will, or whether it even can, result in some kind of political change. You do get the sense that that's what many Cubans want. But look, the Cubans are absolute experts in keeping the population of the island under their thumb. They've been doing it for 67 years. And I think for many of us, we're waiting to see some kind of change, but it's not clear that it will happen.
Well, Cuba has announced these sort of sweeping sort of economic reforms, potential reforms. I mean, right now, obviously, we're talking about a centralized economy. The island and the government in Cuba, they decide what is produced, how it's produced, who produces it, what prices it's sold for. And these changes are, I assume, to obviously placate the Trump administration. Just talk to us about some of these announced changes and what they could mean for this island economically.
The thing about capitalist reforms is that they don't depend exclusively on the government. It is relevant that the Cuban government has announced these changes, which would allow, for example, investment by the descendants of Cuban expats in places like Florida and the private sector in Cuba for the first time. But you have to ask yourself, who would be willing to invest in these conditions? Especially if you bet, as some people do at least, that the Cuban regime is, that they're short timers, that they're not going to be around for much longer. So, the way you asked the question, Zane, this seems more like a political gesture on the part of the Cuban government. No one really senses that it's going to be enough to placate the Trump administration and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, of course, has been dedicated to the prospect of political change in Cuba for much of his career, coming from politics in South Florida, where this has been an issue for so long. So, no, I mean, the feeling that I hear from people in the private sector here in the United States is that this is just these measures really just show a Cuban government that's grasping at straws, trying to do dramatic things in the hope that it can survive. But very few people expect any significant money to come into the country as a result.
Brian, what do you make of the ethics, just the ethics of the way that the US government is going about trying to sort of force Cuba to implement some of these changes, just in terms of inflicting, let's be honest, this sort of suffering on ordinary Cuban people. I mean, everything from, you talk about the summer and blackouts, just the oppressive heat that people are experiencing right now, the food in your fridge obviously spoils. I mean, these are really difficult conditions. People are experiencing real hardship in and around Havana. Your take on the ethics of this method, this way to force Cuba to make change?
That's a very fair question. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's clear that the Cuban government deserves a lot of the blame for the economic policies that have put Cuba in this state. But there's no doubt, as you say, that the measures taken by the Trump administration so far this year have resulted in suffering on the island, and probably, according to reporting that has come out of Cuba, some loss of life as well. People in Washington tell you that this is, the cost that is necessary for there to be a change in, a repressive dictatorship, and the possibility for Cubans to have a better life, whether it's worth it or not. That is, because of the human cost that you point out, is a real question. I would note, my perception, at least as an American who follows Latin America here in the United States, is that this, U.S. role in the suffering on the island has not gotten a lot of political attention here in the United States. You don't really hear people talking about it. You don't see that much coverage of the suffering aspect of it on the news, except for on CNN, one of the few outlets that is still allowed to have reporters there on the ground. Patrick does a great job. But apart from that, it's not really present in the debate here. It's not particularly present in the debate around the rest of Latin America either, where we have seen many left-wing governments lose elections over the last year and a half. These were traditional allies of Havana, who've now been replaced by conservative leaders who are also quite eager to see change, potentially, and supportive of what the Trump administration is doing there. So all of this has kind of produced this alignment where, maybe there's a possibility for change. You do sense that some shift is coming. But how deep it will be, whether it will be regime change or some sort of deal like the U.S. government made with Nicolas Maduro's successors in Caracas, none of us know the answer to that question.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point. Change is coming, but at what cost for the Cuban people, whether it's in terms of the oppressive heat, whether it's in terms of transportation difficulties, the humanitarian aspect of all of this, the hospitals facing shortages, your food in your fridge going to waste. I mean, it's awful what people are going through right now. And you point out that the U.S. does indeed, maybe they're not to blame entirely, but they do indeed have a role to play in the current level of sufferings for the Cuban people right now.
You can look for tourists in Cuba, but good luck finding any these days. The colonial streets and plazas in Old Havana, one of the island's main attractions for foreign visitors, are strikingly empty. Cuba's tourism sector is enduring the worst moment in years, if not decades. We've come to an area that should be absolutely full of tourists to see how bad it's gotten. Rolando is trying to promote the restaurant where he works, but there's hardly anyone to make his pitch to. You don't see any tourists.
Maybe in this moment 10%, 10% tourists in this square that is the best square is Plaza Vieja. The other square in Havana, maybe 10%. It's nothing.
The oil blockade placed by the Trump administration on Cuba earlier this year has contributed to rolling blackouts and a scarcity of jet fuel for airlines carrying tourists from Europe or Canada, which have canceled flights. Threats of increased U.S. economic sanctions on international hotel chains is forcing many companies to abandon the island and remove the brands off hotels they used to manage for the Cuban government. According to official statistics, only 360,000 tourists visited the island in the first 5 months of 2026, a more than 58% drop from the previous year. The Trump administration says it is pressuring the island's communist rulers to open the tightly controlled economy and political system. But people like Elio and Andres, who who have been playing traditional Cuban music on the street corner for nearly 30 years, are among those feeling the squeeze. When we meet them, the guitar duo had earned less than $1 in tips that day. They told me the economy has never been this bad, even during the pandemic.
No, no hay turista aquí.
There are no tourists, Elio says. Maybe they're at home. One comes by only every half hour or hour. Even the famed Hemingway Trail, the bars where the American writer drank his way across Havana, has gone cold. This is one of the most famous bars in Havana. You can see Hemingway's signature there on the wall. This is one of the many places he drank. He said he came here for his mojito. I've never been able to come here without there being just a crush of tourists. We're the first customers of the day. It's a tourist trap without any tourists. For the first time, Cuban officials say, they may allow Cuban exiles or Cubans still living on the island to manage hotels, but full ownership, so far at least, is still not permitted. The collapse of the tourism economy is a disaster for a government that spent years pouring scant resources into building hotels. This is not only Cuba's largest hotel, it's the tallest building on this island. This is one of the most expensive things this government here has ever built. Architects who worked on this project told me it cost more than $200 million to build this hotel, which is now empty and closed. Still, construction continues on even more hotels that are unlikely to see paying customers anytime soon. Cubans who work in tourism are trying anything to make ends meet. Alexander tells us he lowered prices to take a carriage ride with his horse Napoleon so that Cubans could afford a city tour. He still barely makes enough money to pay for his government license to work as a guide. More reforms urgently need to take place, he says.
If we don't change our system, if we don't change our economic model, we'll never survive like a human being. Because every day, daily, there are problems and problems and problems. And if we don't solve, if we don't change those things, you will never have a real future.
Cuba's tourism industry has already collapsed under increased U.S. pressure. Now the fear is the rest of the island's teetering economy could soon follow. Patrick Ottman, CNN, Havana.